Okay, I think we will get started. It's 12:45, so if people want to find a seat. So hello everybody, and welcome to the first Law and Humanities seminar of this academic year. So for those of you who are not familiar with the seminar series, this is a seminar series at STL where speakers focus on topics in the law and humanities broadly defined. So this includes topics such as law and literature, law and art, law and philosophy, and for today I thought we would talk about law and music. And the seminar series features both STL professors who wish to share these topics with you, and also external speakers, so people we invite from outside STL. So we will have a couple of seminars this year, and especially for the students, I hope that you guys come and participate in our seminar series. Today I'm going to be speaking about the topic, thinking about law through music, which is an impossibly broad topic, so we need to narrow it down a little bit. So thinking about law through music, and when I mean law, I'm going to be speaking today specifically about statutes, and more specifically how judges decide cases, how judges approach cases. So in other words, adjudication. And when I talk about music, also I should just point out adjudication in the common law world. So what we're going to talk about today may or may not apply to purely civil law jurisdictions. I'm going to be focused on common law and common law adjudication. And then thinking about law through music, the other big word, of course, in the title is music. And there are all kinds of music that we could discuss, but I'm going to focus on classical music. A couple of disclaimers, especially for the new students in the room. You'll see that lawyers love to give disclaimers about everything. The first disclaimer is I am not a professional musician. I don't claim to be one. I've never been one. So my musical training consists of, when I was younger, I learned piano, violin, and then when I was in college, I took music classes. I studied a bit of conducting, but no formal degree in music, not a professional musician. So sometimes when people hear me play piano, they say, "Oh, Norman, you are a pretty good pianist." And I always have to correct them and say, first of all, I'm not very good. And secondly, I'm not a pianist. I'm a piano player. I play the piano. I'm not a pianist. Lang Lang is a pianist. Okay? So today, this here is not intended to be a piano concert. In fact, I know we have many students at STL who are very talented musicians, and you guys perform, for example, at the campus-wide events. And if you want to hear professional style playing, you should find those STL classmates. Today, I'm using the piano mostly to talk about some musical excerpts we'll use. So that's the first disclaimer, not a professional musician. The second disclaimer is, nothing I'm going to say today is probably that mind-breaking or revolutionary, but I hope the way I present it will be a bit different because scholars have written about music and law and some of the similarities and points of commonality between these two areas. But I hope my approach is somewhat more different and maybe a bit more creative because we're going to use specific musical examples to illustrate some similarities. Okay. So those are the two disclaimers. Now with that, why don't we begin? And the way I'm going to tackle this topic is I would like you guys to think about this question. How do judges, let's say American judges or judges in the common law world, how do they approach easy cases? How do they approach hard cases? Now the easy case versus hard case distinction is not something I picked up. If you guys take legal theory, you will study a very famous American legal theorist called Ronald Dworkin. And Dworkin, De Wojin in Chinese, and he's very interested in understanding how judges in the common law world decide cases. So he divides the universe into easy cases and hard cases. So I'm just going to use that similar categorization. So at least we have some structure for what we are going to talk about today. So let's begin with easy cases. Now, what's the immediate analogy with music? Some scholars have said legislators are like composers. Legislators are like composers. And the scholars who say this, I think you guys can probably appreciate that similarity. Legislators draft statutes using words. Those statutes, technically speaking, after they're done, have no life. Right? They're lifeless. They have to be applied in the real world to have some life. Otherwise, they're just what we sometimes refer to as law on the books that are not applied. Similarly, if you think about it, a composer writes, what is his statute? It is a score of music. He uses language, but he doesn't use words, of course. He uses musical notation. Both the composer and legislator are constrained in the sense. Legislators have to use, well, language and words and in a correct way. Composers are limited by the musical notation that is available. So I think that analogy is pretty clear. And then the same scholars argue legislators are like composers, which makes lawyers and judges what? Lawyers and judges are like performers of music. That's another analogy that some scholars say. Because it is the job of lawyers and judges to interpret what the statutes mean. For judges, they have to apply the statutes, the law to facts. For lawyers, they have to read the statute and make an argument for their client. They also have to apply the law, the statute to the facts, although they may not be the ones, of course, making the final judicial determination. And I think that's very similar, you could say, to in music, the composer writes the score, but the legislator writes the statute. And the performer, the conductor, the pianist, the violinist, he is tasked with interpreting the score and giving it life. I think these are all correct analogies, but today I want to also suggest to you that we should have another analogy, which is that at least in the common law world, lawyers and judges can also be composers too. And that's something I would like to explore today. So, let's begin with easy cases. If I asked you guys, now, of course, in your law school classes, especially the 1Ls who are starting, I think most of the cases you read in your casebooks would not fall under the heading easy case, because otherwise there would not be much to discuss. So what are easy cases? I mean, I think it's quite obvious to probably many of you. Sometimes legislators will write very clear statutes. Sometimes referred to in American law, we call these bright line rules, which means that they are supposed to be easy to apply, and therefore there's not much judicial discretion involved. There's one theorist who teaches in Australia, Jonathan Crow, and he has actually written a lot about easy cases and theories of easy cases. And he basically says easy cases are what? Of course they involve cases where the statute is very clear, and also where the judge's own intuition, legal intuition, applied to the statute will lead to the correct result. Dworkin, that famous philosopher I mentioned earlier, he said that easy cases are basically situations where the law, I'm paraphrasing, the law applies itself. So, and what are some examples of clear statutes or bright line rules in American law which would lead to easy cases for the judge? You guys probably have studied some of them, right? In criminal law, and I'm not an expert in criminal law, we have our Professor Kerr sitting back there. You probably studied things like strict liability crimes. So in the US, for example, there are statutes on rape. And of course, more specifically, there is a crime or a category of crime in the US known as statutory rape. And basically, those are supposed to be very clear rules where if the victim is under a certain age, the law considers that victim incapable of giving any consent. So even if the victim consented, the law will say, no, the statute is clear. If the victim is under a certain age, it is impossible to give consent, and therefore the perpetrator will be found guilty, even if he honestly believed that the victim gave consent, or even if the victim did explicitly give consent. So we might call that a bright line rule. In property law, which of course is a subject close to my heart, there have been bright line rules. So there are old statutes when people are trying to convey land, for example, and let's say a person is trying to convey land in what we call a fee simple absolute, which is a specific type of estate. In the old days, there were statutes that said if you want to create a fee simple absolute in somebody, your conveyance has to be drafted using exact language. So, for example, O to A and his heirs. And you have to use that exact language. If you don't use that exact language, your conveyance, it will not be a fee simple absolute. That would be a bright line rule. Right? Similarly, in music, before we get to hard cases, there are also times when a composer writes a score, and actually it's quote-unquote an easy interpretation. And what do I mean by that? It's like an easy case. The statute is clear, the score is clear as to what the composer precisely wants. Now in Western music, the best example in classical music is what we call program music or programmatic music. And that refers to when a composer is writing music and he's intending for, it is his intention for that music to depict or illustrate a certain program. And what do we mean by program? It could be a story, it could be an idea, it could be a painting, but a painting expressed through music. So why don't we do I'll give you an example. And I have my Bluetooth speaker here. One example, one of the earliest symphonies, 交响乐曲, a big piece composed for orchestra, usually in multiple movements. One of the earliest program symphonies, or symphonies with an explicit program, is by Beethoven. Beethoven Symphony number 6. Some of you guys may know this. It is nicknamed the Pastoral Symphony. Pastoral means what? Rural, having to do with the countryside. And this is a good example because Beethoven explicitly, when he composed the music, he explicitly noted this music is supposed to evoke feelings of the countryside. And the symphony has 5 movements, which is quite unique. Most symphonies during that period have 4 movements. This one has 5. And earlier symphonies only have 3 movements. This one has 5. And Beethoven actually explicitly labels each symphony with each movement with a label, a descriptive label. So the excerpt I'm going to play for you is the first movement, part of the first movement, and the label that Beethoven writes. Of course, it's in German, but translated, it is something like the awakening of happy feelings in men when entering the countryside. The awakening of happy feelings in men when entering the countryside. Okay, most modern, if you get a CD, they sometimes omit the word of men because that may be too exclusive. But I think in the original, Beethoven actually wrote of men. Of course, he's referring to everybody. So, let's just very quickly, I'll just play the opening parts and take a listen.
Battery 100%. Connected to iPhone.
Sorry. Of course, there will be some technical difficulties because we're dealing with a lot of technology here, which I'm not very good at. Okay, so again. Does that make you happy? Right. Right, that's the main theme. And Beethoven's explicit with what he wants, right? It needs to convey a certain type of feeling, right? So that's the main theme. And I would consider that to be similar to an easy case in law. We have clear instructions from the statute or composer. The interpreter is somewhat limited, right? Now, do judges make very odd decisions even if there are clear statutes? Sometimes. But of course there are consequences. They probably would overturn on appeal. Likewise, this theme, right? I have some artistic freedom to do some interpretation. So I might play a little bit faster. Some conductors do. Right, I can play it slower. And maybe spend more time here. Wait, right? And then continue on. But it's an easy case in the sense that this would not be acceptable, right? Now, nothing in music prevents that. Right? I could go out and play it like that. But what would be the result? Well, I would be laughed out. Nobody would listen to my music or my performances. And I might even be overturned in the sense that the higher musical authorities, meaning all the more famous performers, they would say that that performance is not worth listening to. Okay. All right, so that's one example, right, of what might be an analogy between easy cases and so-called clear pieces in music, right? There are other examples I can give you. I did promise musical examples. There's a famous piece by Haydn, 海顿, 1732 to 1809, Austrian composer, very famous also for his symphonies. He wrote this symphony number 94, and it has the second movement. You guys maybe heard this theme before. Let me turn the volume up. Now the important thing about this piece is Haydn, when he wrote it, he said there's a chord that I want to emphasize, and I want to, people say that he said, I want this chord, this particular note, to make all the ladies jump up. And even softer. Softer, and then so forth and so on. Now, that's also a very clear message by the composer. And in fact, some people said, some historical sources tell us that Haydn, is because at his concerts there was an elderly man who used to sit in the same seat all the time and would fall asleep during the slow movements of the symphony. So Haydn wanted to do as revenge, sort of, right? And this piece is now known as the Surprise Symphony. Okay, but I want to make very clear that Surprise is not a name that Haydn gave. It's added by a later person, actually a flute player in the orchestra, and that nickname has stuck. But the point is, Haydn did make clear that I want this to be new, exciting, this note, and even maybe make some of the ladies jump. So again, we're constrained, just like a judge might be constrained by a very clear statute in an easy case. You couldn't interpret it like this, right? That would not be, it would be like misinterpreting a very clear statute. Everybody knows that tune probably. Mozart, piano Piano Sonata 11. And this is the last movement. Mozart gives explicit instructions. He calls this alla turca, which means, some people say Turkish march, but actually that's not the exact translation. It's more in the style, in the Turkish style. And this was all the rage at the time, was stuff from Turkey. It was considered exotic, it was considered new. And people liked listening to Turkish marching music, the Janissaries, the Turkish soldiers. And so alla turca, you see this, performers are rather limited, right? It has to be march-like. Not great. Actually, if you guys look online, Lang Lang has a very famous interpretation because his is like, I can't do it because obviously. Right, it's like triple the speed of anybody else, but you could look it up there. Right, so these are all pieces that I think would be considered easy cases. Let me just see how we're doing on time. All right. Or the analogy I would make with easy cases, right, or easier cases. Now let's talk about hard cases, and that's the more interesting thing to talk about, because hard cases in music, what is the analogy? In music, the analogy is often the composer may not give explicit instructions, or the score may be unclear as to how to interpret the music, and therefore, what is a performer to do? A performer has more leeway, has more freedom to interpret the score as he wishes, and it's harder. There are more choices that need to be made by the performer. Now, before I get to hard cases, just like in law, sometimes a statute, or in common law, of course, courts can also set forth bright line rules through case law. I do want to just point out one thing, is in the law, of course, sometimes a rule might be considered by everyone as a bright line rule, but actually it's not as clear as everybody thinks it is. I guess one example that I have heard, again, I'm not a criminal law expert, but in American law, you probably will study this famous case called Miranda, and it's the idea that the Supreme Court in that case set forth what they thought was a bright line rule, is that when suspects are in custody and about to be interrogated, they need to be provided with a warning, that they have a right to counsel, that they can be silent. You guys have seen movies with this, right? The guy's arrested, taken into custody, and the police always say, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to an attorney, and so forth. That may seem clear, but actually, scholars have said, actually, everybody thinks that Miranda is a bright line rule, but actually, it really isn't anymore. And there are a lot of difficulties in interpreting and applying it. What's custody, what is an interrogation, and so forth. And just remember, in music, there may also be things like that, where you think that the interpretation of a piece is straightforward, but it's actually perhaps not. Just one example before we move on to hard cases. I think most of you will probably know this piece, right? Moonlight Sonata. Everyone calls it that. Moonlight Sonata. Beethoven Piano Sonata. Which number? 14 or 15? Does anyone know? It's one of those numbers. 14. Right. 14, first movement. Right. Everyone calls it moonlight, though. And so when you guys think of moonlight, many people interpret it like, oh, what? Imagine nighttime, right? Two people sitting outside, right? Moonlight. It may seem clear, but actually moonlight is a designation that Beethoven did not make himself. That designation actually came 5 years after his death, when the German music critic was listening to the piece, and he said, this piece makes me think of Switzerland and the moon shining on Lake Lucerne. And so now this piece is synonymous with moonlight. Right? And so some performers say, everybody's playing it wrong. People think it's easy, but the interpretation is more limited, but it's actually not. Some people play it too slow, because they want to, it's like a moonlight. Whereas some performers say it should be more, it should be just more straightforward at least. Right? Okay. So hard cases, going on to hard cases. What is a hard case? Now, some people would say, there was a talk given at STL a couple of years ago by some judges, and it was called Hard Cases, or something like that. I went to the talk, but when I listened to the talk, it seemed that different people have different ideas of what they consider a hard case. For those judges, when they gave the talk, I remember when they meant hard case, they actually meant cases where the emotional facts were very difficult to grasp and to deal with, because it involved very heartbreaking things. But actually, the law was not necessarily that difficult to apply. So when I mean hard cases here, I'm not talking about those cases where it may be very difficult, it's very emotional. I'm talking about cases where what? Well, the statute itself may not be very clear. There may be ambiguities in the statute. We're not exactly sure, therefore, how to apply it or to interpret the statute. Dworkin defined hard cases as what? There are cases where no settled rule dictates either outcome. Either outcome meaning usually either plaintiff or defendant. And so judges will have a problem right here. Judges have a problem. In music, do we have examples of hard cases where the statute, of course, the score, may be unclear, and we're not exactly sure what to do? And more specifically, where there are two competing interpretations. I wanted to find an example with two, because in law, oftentimes the choice is you have a choice between two sides, plaintiff, defendant, prosecution, defense. And I think there is one. I found one that I think is instructive. Schubert. Schubert, Austrian composer, 1797-1828. He wrote a lot of famous pieces. We're going to focus on his symphony, Symphony 9. Okay, Symphony number 9. That's all I'm going to tell you so far, just Symphony number 9. It's in C major. Okay, and I'm going to play you one of the biggest controversies. I wouldn't say big controversy. People argue about it. Specifically, the last note. The last note is really important in a piece, right? Because it's what people leave with. It's their final impression. Similar to if you guys eat a nice meal, the dessert is very important, right? Because if dessert sucks, people have a bad memory of the meal. Anyway, I'll play you, of course, the orchestra version. But basically, you'll hear this is the final movement at the end. The orchestra is going crazy, very exciting, right? Let me see, how does it go? Now this last note. So the problem is we're not exactly sure the ambiguity rendition. But I do, let's see. These are two conductors, and they took two approaches. Let's begin with option 1, shall we? Okay, this is connected, good. I'll play the beginning part of the fourth movement, just so you can get the idea of what it sounds like, right? that gives you the energy, right? Right? So walk into Professor Campbell, Professor Kurzweil, one else, get ready, right? Next option. So this is the beginning. Is this similar? Okay, but let's skip. Before we get into the grit of the analysis, I'm just curious. A show of hands, your personal preference. Option 2, that one. Option 1? Most conductors do option 1. I actually like option 2, but let me ask you guys, now let's discuss this. You don't need to know anything about music to answer these questions, okay? And so I would also like to make this seminar interactive, because it's a seminar, not a lecture. If you need to make a decision as to which one option to choose, what might you consider? Anybody? What are things that you would consider to decide?
I think I would consider my need for music at that time. If I really need a piece of music that's really exciting, I might choose option 1. But for me, right now, I really want to sleep, so I choose option number 2.
Okay, your personal needs or personal preferences.
Yes.
Let me extend your answer by saying a conductor, interpreter, a performer might also consider the needs of the audience. That poll we just did, if I'm a conductor, I probably know that. Most people like option 1. So if I do a concert, music, of course, should be enjoyed on its own terms, but if you're a conductor, you have your reputation to worry about, you want people to like you want people to come back and listen to you want people to buy tickets. And if most people like option 1, that's more suitable for the society, so to speak, or the audience. Maybe you do that one. Okay, good. What other things would you consider?
I think maybe the ending is, if the purpose of the ending is to serve the whole music or the complete part of this performance, so that we need to make it consistent with the whole the target or the goal of what we need to.
The purpose of the composition.
Yes.
So actually you made many good points. You said one thing as a performer you would consider. So this is different from her consideration, everybody see? You're not that concerned with audience needs or your need.
Yes.
You're concerned with how does this last note fit into the final movement? How does the final movement fit into the whole piece as a whole? What's the purpose of the piece? What's the purpose of the final movement? Oh, good. Oh, there's one basic one nobody mentioned yet. What's the first thing you would do? If you listen to these options, you want to see which one is the better. What's the first thing you would do? Assuming you can read music, what's the first thing you do? Well, you look at the score, right? Yeah. Now, unfortunately, in Schubert's autograph, in this last note of C, there's a hairpin. And the problem is, also, I can't draw it exactly, but scholars say it was written unclearly, like a vague statue almost. And so we're not sure if Schubert intended like what we call in music a forzando, which means a sudden sort of accented, or whether he meant what we call in music, this is not terribly important. The vocabulary is not terribly important, but it's called diminuendo, which is the when you lower the volume like that. Okay, so, but I like how you said, yeah, check the score, right? That should be the first thing. When you have a statute, you always check the words first. Okay? Interestingly, everything that you guys said, those are also approaches to statutory interpretation. When we are confronted in law with an unclear statute, and at STL we offer, of course, the statutory interpretation taught by Professor Stevenson from Harvard Law School. If you're interested in statutory interpretation, you can take that class. What are some ways in which statutes are interpreted? There are many ways you can call these, approaches. One approach is known in law as the textualism or textual approach, where you read the statute, focus on the words and the meaning of the words, the plain meaning of the words. Some people like that because it's a more objective way, they think, of interpreting a statute. Then you have and that's sort of like a look at the score, right? And so some composers say, well, the hairpin there, we think it's pretty clear that it was meant to be a forzando. Okay. By the way, in the modern editions, if you guys read music, check the modern editions out. The editors for the modern editions don't help us. You know why? Because they write two things under the last note. FZ, which is forzando, and they do a diminuendo, right? It's basically they're not sure which one it should be. So we'll give you both, right? And then you work it out. So textualism is one approach in statutory interpretation in law, just like checking the score. Purposivism, understanding the purpose behind a statute, is another way we can understand a statute, an unclear statute. And you guys may have studied things like, we go look for the legislative history of a statute to try to understand what the legislators had in mind when they were drafting that statute. That's sort of like your contribution earlier, right? The notion that we look to see what's the purpose of the piece, how does this fit in, okay? I can give you some additional information that might help you. The piece is really long, almost an hour. It's a symphony. There's a nickname for it too. This might help you for purpose. It's called great, like great, big. Again, we always have to be careful in music about nicknames of pieces. Schubert never actually said, this symphony I'm going to call great. The naming comes from a letter he actually wrote to a friend of his, I think it was a friend. Basically, Schubert says, I'm working on some music now, some chamber music, but I think I'm going to use those tunes for what he called a grosse Symphonie. Right? My German is terrible, right? Which is a great symphony. So that's where it comes from. So that might be important information for you to have if you're focused on purpose, because Schubert, he has this mind. Great, of course, could mean either big in scale or it could mean wonderful. So with that additional information, what would you think? Which option is?
I still choose option one.
Option one, right? And many conductors would agree with you. They would say it seems ridiculous to end this big, flashy piece, right, with a, And then sometimes judges, when they're dealing with a difficult statute, besides textualism, purpose of the statute, they may consider what we might just call other factors, right? These are similar to what you said. You said what are your needs, and I mentioned what are the audience's needs. And judges may also consider things such as, well, how's my decision going to impact the public? What is going to be the impact on the public? What's going to be the impact on the court? What's going to be the impact on the jurisprudence in this particular area of law? These are things I all need to consider. Sometimes in law courses, some professors may refer to this as sort of the quote-unquote policy reasons behind a decision. Although very few judges will obviously admit ever that they're making decisions based exclusively on policy, that policy is the main reason. But that's similar to what you said. So you guys see there are analogies there as well. Hard cases, how do we interpret a hard statute? A difficult to interpret piece of music as well. Okay. So Schubert is one good example. And there are many other examples, of course, we could talk about. There's, for example, Bach, right? Bach, one of the, of course, most famous composers. Interestingly, in mainland China, I think he's referred to as Ba He. In Taiwan, we call it Baha, right? So, but I think most people would know, right? 1685, 1750. Bach's music oftentimes is difficult to interpret because often in his manuscripts he'll write the notes down, right? And doesn't give much indication of what he wants often, depending on the piece, of course. One famous piece that I think many of you may have heard, even if you may have not have studied music before, right? From the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. It's the first prelude, C major. The original manuscript just has the notes. So you could liken this to, if you're a performer, you've got a problem. How am I going to interpret this piece? Now, modern editions, people have added dynamic markings, but again, those are editors. Many editors added those things. How are you going to interpret that? It's lovely, you have to admit, right? And Bach is a genius because actually this piece, in terms of chord structure, it's basically just what? But that would be so boring. If I just played right, so he does something. He breaks it up. And then it's like, just brilliant, right? How do we do this? Now you guys know this, in music there are many debates, right? First of all, some people might say I'm playing on the wrong instrument, because there was no piano in Bach's time. There were things like harpsichords, which did not distinguish volume. Also, did anybody notice how I played that? There's something in the piano called a pedal, and this sustains the sound. So for example, if I just play one note like this without the pedal, that's how it sounds. If I play it with the pedal, it sustains. And you notice I deliberately played it with the pedal. You like that, Blair? Famous pianists have done both interpretations. And again, if you're a performer, what do you look for? You might look at the textual approach, look at the score, but the score doesn't tell us much. Purpose. I can tell you a couple of things. Bach, in his introduction to the Well-Tempered Clavier, he actually writes a short preface. That could be useful information to have, right? He writes things like, these preludes, and I'm paraphrasing, these preludes and fugues are for the benefit of musical youth, young people who want to learn music, who have a desire, and also for experienced people. If it's for, right, if it's for, I think if you focus on purpose, just like you focus on purpose of a statute, if it's just set for the instruction of musical youth, it seems more that second option, right? Where we're enunciating everything clearly. That might be more accurate than, because we want musical youth to learn that. And then of course the other factors, your approach, the needs of the audience, and so forth. Okay? So that's, okay. How much time? Just another example of, everybody knows this. 5, first movement. I'm not going to play it on the phone just to save time. I just played it here. But even that piece also presents like a hard case interpretive issues. One option conductors have done. This is one interpretation by a prominent conductor. You see? So what do we do? Look at the score? Well, the score, the reason why we can have so many interpretations is arguably the score may not be that clear as to exactly what Beethoven intended. Purpose, well, this is also getting into a lot of problems because some people say Beethoven said that the first notes were supposed to be like destiny knocking on a door. Bum, 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 bum. But then that's disputed. We don't know if that's true or not. Right, so you have these interpretations. The option 2, right, some conductors say that's more in line with what Beethoven would have wanted and practices during his time. The first one I played, you guys remember, that's the more dramatic one. Wait, right? They said, well, that would be a better interpretation. So these are all analogies with, I think, hard cases. The last thing to mention in the time we have left is I'd like to finally use music as an analogy to understanding how we might think of the development of common law. So we looked at music in easy cases, music in hard cases. What about common law development? Everybody knows that one of the most dramatic things that can happen in the common law is when what? A judge overturns a precedent. That's hugely dramatic. And you guys notice I'm using the word dramatic deliberately because it's a very special thing. And John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, during his confirmation hearings in 2005, he described the overturning of precedent. He described it as a jolt. He used that word like an electricity, jolt. So how do we think about this through music? Well, I would argue that there is actually a very good musical form that kind of mirrors this development of the common law and then the overturning of a precedent. And this is the form of music known as theme and variations. When a composer begins with a theme, you can think of as a main earlier precedent, and then he writes variations which at first they don't completely overturn the original theme, but they modify it slightly, and over time the variations get more and more away from the original theme, but still retain some of the original flavor. And interestingly, Justice Roberts, during his confirmation hearing, he made a similar point. He said, even in cases in American law where a precedent has been overturned, the most famous example he gave too was, some of you may know the Brown v. Board of Education decision, right, about the segregation of black and white students, right, unconstitutional. He said even that one, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson in earlier cases, he said if you study the trajectory of the court, one of the rationales in Brown v. Board of Education the court made, they didn't just say, oh, we want to get rid of the precedent. They said, over time, we've seen the old precedents being slightly chipped away at. Right? So our decision to overturn Plessy is not anything revolutionary or new. And that's kind of like a variation approach, right? The most famous example I can give you, Mozart again, he wrote variations on a French folk song, right? I don't know the French name, and I'm going to butcher it, so I'm not going to say it, but the song is known as, Mother, Shall I Tell You Something? Okay? And everybody knows the main theme, which Mozart did not write, right? It's a French theme. Right? Right? That's the French folk song, which we also know as Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Also alphabet song A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. Also Ba Ba Black Sheep, a British nursery song. Now Mozart then takes that theme and like perhaps how judges develop precedents and modify precedents if need to, right? He can change that, right? So for example, that's a little bit different. Maybe it's like a precedent where you guys can still hear the theme, right? Okay. However, the common law may develop where there are more dramatic modifications. And you hear that it's still there, but what's Mozart done? He's shifted from major to minor. That sounds quite different, right, the ending? And then Mozart even writes variations that seem very different than the original theme, right? So that may be one way you can think of or analogize sort of law of music as well. Theme and variations and this sort of development of common law. Okay, the last point I would just make is I hope this seminar has at least given you a way to think about law. Law school can be quite difficult. It can be very challenging at times. But hopefully this gives you another way to think about law and to remember that law, of course, law in a way is a science, a social science in the sense that you have certain, when you go to law school, it's different from studying literature because in law there are certain models and rules you have to follow. Right? But law is also aesthetic. It's also in many ways artistic, which is why I think the final point I would leave with you guys is perhaps law and music has more in common than we think. Music is also a science because notes, sound, those are all mathematical, scientific things. Okay, I'm not a math science person, so I'm not going to go into the details of sonority and pitch. So similarly, music is an art form. The most common comparison people like to make is law and literature. Some of you guys may have heard that. And it's a natural comparison in many ways because literature is also an art form, but it's using written words. And law, of course, is done and practiced and studied and written using written words. So obviously there's that strong connection there. But sometimes I think music may be a better analogy because literature, you could argue, literature is not as scientific as music. You could basically write whatever you want. Of course, there are good literature and bad literature, but music may in fact be perhaps a more accurate comparison. And so that's my seminar for today, and I went a little bit over time. But I guess we have time for questions, or one or two questions, if anybody has anything, or any comments. Yes, Professor Campbell.
I have students should go first, and they don't have a question. So one of the things that's big in music now is sampling, but also transformation. So for example, the hard rock metal anthem, We're Not Gonna Take It by Twisted Sister, which is a hard rock anthem if ever there was one. The melody is taken from the Christmas carol, O Come All Ye Faithful. And obviously in rap, there's a sample of a certain amount of music from other people. How would you analyze, what analogy in the law would you have on that?
So I'm not familiar with the rock sampling technique, but they're taking tunes that were composed before, like the Christmas carols, and transforming them.
Oh, Come All You Faithful is a very sweet Christmas
Right,
anthem.
that's right.
We're Not Gonna Take It. It is not. It's
That,
is that like importing American codes from China, or?
like an analogy for transplantation,
I mean,
it's possible, or it could be, or one might say that the more general analogy to be made is that music perhaps more so than other art forms. And I know I may be getting into some dangerous territory here, especially if we have literature and art people, painters here. But music is, of course, any time a composer writes a piece, a piece of music is very much indebted to previous forms or previous pieces. When composers such as Schubert, Brahms, they write their own music, but they also include many techniques and styles from Beethoven. Right? So music builds off of previous music. The example you gave would be a very direct example where a tune is taken directly and then modified. And so I guess the general analogy might be that when you study law, especially the common law with precedents, essentially judges are building off of a set base of decisions and approaches already. And that might be a commonality with music. Yes, Professor.
Thank you.
No, it's you.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation, which I very much enjoyed and I found very enriching and evocative. And I'm wondering about how far the analogy can be pushed, and I think you did so a little bit in your presentation. So your presentation can be read as saying that law is an aural, right? An aural experience, the ear. And you also mentioned literature as visual, but then you stopped short of mentioning painters. And what about other senses, people who use taste for their engagement with the world? Does it just stop with those two senses, the hearing and the seeing? Is that as far as your analogy will go?
Well, the short answer would be, at this point, that's as far as I think the analogy can go, mainly because literature and music, I think, work because obviously literature you have a text, music you also have a text through music notation, and there's a process of interpretation that may be a bit different. And I'm not an art painting person, but that I think strikes me as somewhat different than, say, you have a painting. Maybe painters would say we are also using a language, right, the medium of painting. But that language seems to me a bit less, I don't mean to sound offensive, but less organized or perhaps less structured, maybe is the word, than say, literature written using text, words, grammar, punctuation, and music, which is written through specific music notation.
So you project, for example, a world-famous chef who gave a presentation called Law as a Culinary Experience. This you project outright.
I would probably say that, maybe I wouldn't use the word reject, but I would probably say that might be a weaker analogy than literature and music, I'd say. Thank you. Yes, Virginia?
Hi, Professor. My question is, when Beethoven, in his last years, he composed, and he cannot find the right performance to play, because that technique is too complicated. And similar to the case Brown versus Board of Education, the court say that, the society is not ready for this, and we have to wait until the society, gradually. So my question is, when a composer can actually say that I like this music and that I want to compose it now, but a legislator may have to compromise for some time.
Well, that's an interesting analogy. And actually, you could even say one analogy with law and music there is, like in the example you gave, some composers may have music they want to write, but it may not be suitable for the time, but they really want to write it. There are examples like this, perhaps besides Beethoven. I'm not familiar with the exact Beethoven works you're referring to, but I can think of two examples. Dmitri Shostakovich, a famous Soviet composer, there were many times in his life where he would draft certain symphony sketches, but then he would put them aside because he didn't think they were ready yet. Another example is Igor Stravinsky, Russian composer. He wrote this famous piece called The Rite of Spring. Very dissonant, very different from the music of the period. But he took a risk and he had it performed. I think the first performance was perhaps in Paris or so in the early 1910s. And we know that after the performance there were riots. Imagine that, riots, because people were just so horrified at the music, at how new Stravinsky's approach was. Yeah, I guess that could be analogized to law. The legislator example, maybe legislators will have to wait. Or judges say that. There are decisions, for example, we know where judges have said, and I think, if memory serves me correctly, in some of the affirmative action cases, where in America colleges use race as a factor in admissions. I think there was one decision earlier on where Justice O'Connor, I think, wrote something like, well, maybe in the future we wouldn't need this kind of race-based admissions, and it can be done away with, but not yet. I think that was basically what she had said, and that's sort of similar to the analogy you're making with composers who have to wait. Well, thank you, everybody. We're out of time, and there's a class in here, so at 2. But thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to answer